Among the various oscillators we have available within Falcon, there are granular and multigranular oscillators, which will allow us to manipulate and shape our audio files and samples to create whatever we can dream up. Now, in this tutorial, we're going to take an in-depth look at both of these oscillators to develop a clear understanding of the various parameters contained within each and how we can best use them to shape our sounds. And we'll begin with the single granular oscillator and then move on to the multigranular. Now, both oscillators contain some similar controls, so as we learn the parameters contained within the single granular oscillator, these will then translate over to the multigranular. Now, we have two ways that we can begin working with the granular oscillators. So we can come over to the oscillator browser here, and then under the sample folder, if we expand that out, we can see we have the granular and multigranular. So we're starting with the single granular, so we can always just drag that into our mapping editor, move that to the top so it spans across the keyboard range. And then we can see our oscillator is here and we don't have a sample loaded. So then we would come to our file browser and we can then pick an audio file that we'd like to load, drop that, and we can see that that's been loaded into our granular oscillator. Now, a simpler way, let's empty out that part and start over. A simpler way would be to just come to the audio file we would like to work with, drag that over to our mapping editor. Let's hover near the top to spread that across the entirety of the keyboard. Let go. And this is going to load up. Usually the basic sample oscillator will be loaded, but this file must have metadata contained within it, which has caused Falcon to open up the slice editor. There are some markers contained within this file, apparently. But what we could do here, normally when you drop your audio file in, it's going to load up the basic sample oscillator. That's what you'll see. You could right click on that tab and then choose granular. Okay, and now we have our single granular oscillator loaded. Now I'd like for our sample to play back at its original pitch on C3, so I'm just going to come to the root key here, double click and change that to C3, press enter. And since we're just going to be working with this granular oscillator, we don't need to see anything else. So let's kind of hide some of these other things, the program section, the layer section, the key group section, and we're just going to leave the oscillator section open here. And let's collapse that mapping editor and come to the bottom here and just expand that out. Now, starting from the top, we've already seen this tab here. We can right click on it to choose a different oscillator that we would like to work with. Next to that, we have a little information button. So if I click on that, we can see information about our sample. These gear icons are going to hide or show our oscillator controls. Then we have a drop-down menu for loading presets, saving our sample, saving as, and we have right and left arrows where we can navigate between any presets that we have saved. And actually the single granular oscillator has some defaults or presets that we can choose from here. So if we'd like to, let's actually play this back to hear how the sample sounds as it is. Okay, so I'm actually going to right click and let's normalize that really quickly. Okay, that's a bit better. Now, coming back up to the top, we have some presets that we can choose from. So for instance, if we'd like to do the backward, we can choose that. Okay, chorused, and so on. You can come up here and go through some of these to hear what can be accomplished by choosing these. And these could be a good start to give you an idea of what the different parameters and controls down below will do to your audio file. If you take note of the adjustments that are made between each, then this can help you learn how to better use these parameters to accomplish what you'd like to get done. But let's set this back to the default. And below that, we have this timeline or ruler that we can right click on and choose samples or seconds if we'd prefer to work in those formats, but I'm going to leave this on beats. As we saw a moment ago, when we right click, we have a variety of different actions that we can apply to our audio file. And I've already covered these in a tutorial on the basic sample oscillator, so we won't go through all of these. If you'd like more information, just check out the link up above here. But you saw that I normalize here. We can crop, delete, reverse, and all these other actions, apply different effects. One important thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to use some of these in your sound design, be sure that you come up to the drop-down menu and choose to save sample as after you've perform your actions. Because if you save sample, this will change your original audio file that you brought in from your browser. So just be careful if you're going to apply some of those actions. Be sure that you save sample as if you'd like to keep your original file intact. Now also to keep in mind, when we apply the actions within this contextual menu, say if we were to reverse, if we don't have any part selected, then it's going to reverse the entire file. You can see there, I'll right click and undo that reverse. If I select a specific portion and then choose reverse, it's just going to apply to that specific portion that I have selected. And I'm going to play this back really quickly because I'm going to, I don't really want to work with the rest of this here, so I'm going to crop this first section. That's pretty much all that we need. I'm going to hold down Alt and click to take the speed back to its default position. So I'm going to click, hold, and select all of this here and choose crop. And this is basically all that we need to work with to get an understanding of the parameters within here. Note that we also have start and end markers. So in their default position, if I trigger, then we're going to start right there. If I were to pull this in, then we're going to start there. As with the end marker, we're going to play all the way to the end in its default position. If I were to pull that in, then we're just going to play this portion here. I'm going to pull that back to the original position, as well as our start marker. And actually, before we move on, I'm going to jump ahead actually a little bit and talk about the position control, because that relates to our start and end markers. So this is going to, when our position is at 0%, it's going to begin playback from wherever our start marker is positioned. So we can see that there. If I were to move this to 50%, then this should start playback essentially halfway between our start and end marker locations. So I'll go ahead and trigger this, and we should play back around here. Okay, and again, that's in relation to our start and end markers. So if I were to pull this in, then we should start playback there. If I were to change the position back to 0%, then we should begin playback at the beginning of our start marker. Okay. So I'm going to take the start marker back to the beginning, and let's take a look at the very first parameter within our oscillator controls. We have a section for grain and position. So the size is going to determine the length of our grains, and playing back at the root note, which I have set to C3, this is actually not going to make that much of a difference to the sound that we're hearing. So I'm going to trigger C3. Okay, if I increase this all the way to the right at 500 milliseconds, okay, still sounds pretty much the same. If we decrease that to 5 milliseconds, okay, both of those sound pretty much the same, depending, no matter what we have this set to. But once we move away from that original pitch of C3, then that's when it's going to make a difference. So if I Alt click and take that back to the default of 100 milliseconds, and then if I play up and then cut this, then we're going to hear a difference. So let's cut. So that's going to get a bit more grainy, and if we play down below, but moving back towards The default 100 milliseconds is going to kind of smooth that out. If we raise it up even more, let's play higher. Okay, so just know that the size is going to help smooth out your sample if you're going to play it above or below the original pitch. So now the size, as we talked about, is going to determine the size of our grains, and we can choose between 500 milliseconds down to 5 milliseconds. So what the granular synthesis does is cuts our audio file into many different grains, and their size is going to be determined here. Now next we have density, and this is going to determine the density of the grains. So we can set the grain size here, and the density is going to determine how many of these size grains we have within our audio file. So if we were to imagine bringing this audio file into our DAW and then, say, slicing that up, then we can see that changing the size is going to make those slices smaller or larger, and the density is going to control how many of them that we have. And these actually work together as with a lot of these other parameters. And when you're learning the granular oscillator within Falcon, while you can have an understanding of what each discrete parameter does, your best bet is going to be to play with them all for long periods of time to understand how they better relate to one another, because just understanding a certain concept of one parameter is not going to really give you a full understanding of how they all relate to each other, even though we're going to try to cover that here. Okay, next in line we have jitter, and this control is going to vary the playback timing of the grains. So let's come to our position section and our speed. Let's set this to, now the default here, if I alt click, is going to be 1. This will play our sample back at its original speed, but we want to slow that down to hear the effect more of the jitter. So, and let's change our position from 0%, which is going to start at the beginning of our start marker, or where our start marker is placed, to somewhere about there, a quarter of the way through. So we're getting a consistent timing of the grains. When we take the jitter up, then you're going to notice a variation in the timing. So some of them are longer, some of them are shorter. Let's take this all the way up. Okay, so that's what the jitter is going to do. And then next we have window, and the window is going to determine the envelope of the grains. So when your audio file is processed and the grains are created, basically they're going to have kind of an envelope, and this is going to allow you to set the shape of that envelope. By default, this is going to be on triangle, and if I alt click on the speed, let's see what else. The jitter, take that back to 0, the density to 1. If we take these back to their default settings, then that sounds smooth within the triangle shape for our window, or the envelope for the grains. Now if I were to change this to squared, you should hear a bit of a tremolo effect, a slight effect. So you can hear how the sound of our grains is going to be affected by this window setting. And the fade works in tandem with the window setting. Well, of course, all of these kind of work together, and you can wind up with crazy different things depending on how you're setting each one. But these two directly work with each other. So the fade is going to set the amount of the grain affected by the envelope that you have set here. So with the squared, our fade is at 100%. And if I decrease that and play back again, you can hear that's a lot choppier. And the fades, while those have been taken out, we can hear more of that squared window. If I take that back up. So if we really wanted an on-off stutter effect for the sample that we're working with, then we could take that fade down, put it on the squared window, and decrease the density the size a little bit. Okay. Now the symmetry also works with window and fade as well. So the symmetry, essentially when we have this in the center, the envelope is going to have an attack and a decay. So with symmetry set to center or 50%, then we're going to have an introduction, a gradual increase in our attack, and a gradual decay. When we move this to the left, then we have an immediate attack, which is going to give us an even more percussive sound. And when we move this all the way to the right, then we have more of a gradual introduction of our sound and a sharp decay. So let's alt-click to take that back to the default of 50%. Let's trigger our sample again. So if we want an even more percussive sound, then we can take this to the left, which is going to give us an immediate attack for our squared window or envelope. Now if I move this to all the way to the right, then we should have a more gradual attack and a sharp decay. But we do need to introduce our fade back in because all of these work together. So I will alt-click to set that to the default. Let's take our fade all the way to 100% so we can be sure to hear this. In the center position, we have a gradual introduction to the attack, relatively speaking, and a gradual decay. Okay, so it's kind of soft since we turn that back up to 100%. If I move all the way to the left, then we have a sharp attack and a percussive sound. Now, all the way to the right, we're going to have a gradual attack and a sharp decay. It almost sounds like it's been reversed. Okay, I will alt-click and set these to their defaults. And let's move on to the position section. And we've already seen what the position control does. This is going to determine where our playback initially starts within our sample in relation to our start and end markers. So we won't go back into that. And we've also taken a look at the direction and I believe the speed. So the direction at 1 is going to play this back with no change to our original sample. But as we decrease, it's going to slow down. If we move all the way to the left, we'll reverse. And we have an additional speed control here. So moving to the right is going to speed up. To the left will slow down, or all the way at 0 will stop and remain static on a single grain. Okay, now if we'd like to set up a loop, by default it's going to be on none. So let's set this up to a forward loop, so we should start from the beginning and keep cycling over and over. Okay, and forward, backward, play to the end, from the end to the front. Okay, so our speed is all the way up to 10. Let's take this down a little bit while we take a look at the variation. And this is essentially going to kind of modulate or vary the position of our playback cursor anywhere from 0 milliseconds, which is the default setting, to 500 milliseconds. So we're going to get a variation in the position as it's playing back. So let's actually take the speed down kind of low. So our variation is at 0. Let's gradually increase that. So you can hear how the playback is jumping from grains within the time range in this setting of a 500 millisecond range. And at 0, it's just going to play the grain that's directly being triggered at the position of the playback cursor. And I skipped over the pitch variation and pitch correction. So pitch variation is basically going to play back different pitches as the playback cursor moves throughout the sample, and you can choose within cents with a range between 0 or no pitch variation all the way up to 1 octave or 12 semitones. So at 0 cents or no change, we know what that's going to sound like. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. Now the pitch correction, this is going to determine how the grains will be transposed. So with the period setting, this is going to adjust the size of the grain. If we use the grain size, this is going to keep the size of our grains constant. So let's listen to the grain size. Still at 12, 1 octave of pitch variation. And period. So you can hear some of those are shorter, some are longer. Whereas the grain size is constant in the length of those pitch changes. I'm going to Alt-click to take that pitch variation back to 0. And to finish out, I think, we've just talked about these different parameters and what their settings do. And let's just spend maybe a couple of minutes. I'm going to set these back to their default positions. And I'm just going to play the sample back and make some adjustments here just so you can have an idea of some of the different things that you can do, the tweaks that you can make to get different sounds to your sample. And actually, I think I will add a touch of reverb to this. So let's view our layer section by clicking up above here. We can see our effects there. Let's come to reverb and choose spark verb. Let's choose abyss. I'm going to take the mix way down. Okay, let's hide that. And let's just experiment for a couple of minutes, and then we'll move on to the multigranular oscillator.